Hi everybody, and thank you again for watching another episode of Gaffer in Gear. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the Storm 1200X from Aputure. So this light is bow and mount compatible. It has this very easy to use Pro Lock system. Now, what sets this apart from other variable white lights or bicolor lights is this light actually doesn't have any white color emitters. It uses their BLAIR light engine. Blue, lime, indigo, amber and red. That gives it a CCT range from 10,000 Kelvin all the way down to 2,500 Kelvin with full green and magenta capability. It also even has an XY mode for color matching, which covers about 80% of the Rec 709 color standard. It has built-in CRMX and it's IP65 rated. Let's start off the review with the regular disclaimers. Aputure are not paying me any money for this review, and they don't have any say over the edit, and I also don't have any financial agreements in place with them. However, they did send me the light and the reflector kit free of charge for the review, and I do get to keep it. So technically, that is a payment, and that is something that you should be aware of because it might possibly impact my views. Now this light has a BLAIR light engine, so it's a bit different to our traditional bicolor lights. It doesn't have any white LED emitters. Now that is not something that we're unfamiliar with. We've got RGB ACL lights, for example, which can also generate white light, but they're full color gamut lights. The idea of this light is it's meant to be a truer color spectrum bicolor or variable white light. The biggest point of difference with this light is the indigo emitter. This indigo emitter is in the ultraviolet spectrum just below our visible spectrum. Now, I'm not going to go too much into talking about what this does because it's been covered in great depth in other reviews. If you're really interested, I'd suggest going to John Roach's YouTube channel, which is Gaffer's Salon, and having a look at the 1200X review there, where he talks to Tim Kang, who is one of the world's leading color scientists. Alright, so having this ultraviolet in the spectrum makes things look better. But what about safety? Are we going to sunburn the actors with this? Am I going to sunburn myself? Am I going to get ultraviolet poisoning? Well, I asked Aputure how much ultraviolet light was actually coming out of this light, and they were more than happy to tell me, but the problem was I didn't understand the answer because I'm not highly educated. So I asked them to quantify it in a way that gaffers would understand, something that would make sense to me and to you and to anyone else who's been on a set using lights. So the question I asked was, in comparison to an M18 HMI lamp head, how much ultraviolet is coming out of this? And the answer, 30% less ultraviolet comes out of this than comes out of an M18 HMI. So let's talk about the advantages and possible disadvantages of the BLAIR light engine. So this light engine mixes colors together to generate white light, but it's not a full color gamut light. So in the graphic here, you can see the gamut range of the BLAIR light engine. And as you can see, it doesn't have the full color range. So for example, if you were lighting a white cyc and you wanted to have a massive amount of colors to select from, this is not the light that you would choose. But this does have some advantages that were previously only available to you in COB lights if you had a full color gamut light, such as the extended CCT range. This has a CCT range from 2,500 Kelvin up to 10,000 Kelvin. You also get the advantage of full green and magenta correction. This can correct all the way up to 100% green and all the way down to 100% magenta, whereas a lot of our bicolor lights that have green and magenta correction are very limited with their green and magenta correction. This can also track to the daylight curve, and it can also track to the Planckian curve. Now, here's the real big advantage of the BLAIR light engine. A full color gamut light engine was designed to create lots of colors, whereas the BLAIR light engine was specifically made with a reduced color gamut, with the emphasis being on selecting the color emitters that give you the best possible combination for white light. So that really gives this light engine the following advantages. It's got incredible color render scores, incredible CCT accuracy, and incredible white point accuracy. But the big advantage is it's not a full color gamut light, so you're not paying full color gamut light prices. This sells for about the same price as a good bicolor light. Let's continue going on with the pros. The build quality of everything is what I would expect from a top-line Aputure product. The ProLock mount is just easy to use and superb. The controller and the head have an IP65 rating, so you can use them outside in the rain. And the low-end dimming results are superb. So if you're a gaffer starting out and you can't afford to buy a 600 watt light or a 300 watt light, you could buy this 1200 watt light and simply dim it. Now let's go through the possible negatives, and the biggest possible negative for me is the DMX cueing. If you're going to do fade up and fade downs, you're going to want to have the smoothing turned on, and it has that Aputure signature 1 second delay before it responds, which is very, very frustrating. The next possible negative is to do with the pulse width modulation dimming system. Aputure's pulse width modulation dimming is the least flicker free of any pulse width modulation dimming that I review. Now, your pulse width modulation dimming is the dimming mode that gives you the super accuracy when you're down the low end. Now, they do have a solution to this, which is the high speed mode. In the high speed mode, you are completely flicker free, but you can't dim the light below 40%. Now, why this is a negative for me is it's really inconvenient if I'm working on an advertising campaign where we've got multiple people shooting. For example, we might have a cinematographer shooting motion capture for the TV commercial. He's always going to want the lights below 40%. Then I've got the stills guy. He doesn't want any motion blur, so he's going to shoot at a high speed shutter. Now, he's going to see the flicker in the pulse width modulation, so I need to change it over to the other dimming system. The next possible negative is the maximum head lead run is 7.5 meters. Now, as a safety feature, they've designed it so you can't link multiple head leads together. And the last thing I find irritating is the user interface. We've got 3 parameters of adjustment: brightness, CCT, and green magenta, and we've only got 1 knob. Now let's talk about things they did really well, but in my opinion, didn't quite smash out of the park. When this light receives CRMX, it goes to a DMX homepage. This homepage shows you every applicable setting that you've got the light set to, which is way better than the previous lights, which just came up with DMX controlled. Now, if this page showed you the parameters that were being adjusted, such as CCT and plus minus green, it would have been a home run in my opinion. And if you could change your DMX selections from this page, instead of going back into the menu system, that would have smashed it out of the park. The next thing they did extremely well, but didn't quite smash out of the park, was the crazy accurate CCT and the crazy accurate delta UV. Now, when I say crazy accurate, I mean you could use this light to test your color spectrometer. But you get crazy accurate CCTs if you're using it with no modifier attached, and you get the crazy accurate delta UVs if you're using it with the reflector attached. It can't do both at the same time. Now, one thing I think I've got to mention in this review is the brightness differences between the Storm 1200X and the Evoke 1200B, because I think a lot of gaffers are going to be considering switching over to the Storm for the simple fact that it has green and magenta correction. Now, there's a lot of misinformation that's online at the moment about how bright this is in comparison to the Evoke, and it's all unintentional. None of it by the manufacturers, by the way. All right, so one thing you've probably heard is that the Storm is way brighter than the Evoke with nothing attached to the front, and this is true. You've probably also heard that with the wide or flood dishes, the Storm is again way brighter, and you've probably heard that with the medium dishes, the Storm is way brighter, and you've also probably heard, you guessed it, with the spot reflectors, that the Storm is way brighter, sometimes by as much or more than 50% brightness. Now, a lot of people are putting this down to the magical qualities of the BLAIR light engine, but I've got a more simple theory as to why this is. Nobody's taking into consideration that all of the reflectors and the lights have different beam angles. Let's start off with the heads. The Evoke is a native flood. It has a massive spread, whereas the Storm is spotted up quite a bit. Now, to give you something else to compare it to, this is the 1200X, and this is the Aputure 1200D, which doesn't have a very wide beam angle either. But the 1200X isn't as wide as the beam angle on the 1200D. Now, is this going to be a problem in terms of soft light modifiers? Well, I don't think it is. So to give you more of a realistic idea of the beam angle, this is the 1200X with no modifier, and this is the 1200X with its 45-degree reflector. So I think it's definitely got enough flood to light up most softbox modifiers. So this is the inside of the Lantern 90 lit up with the 1200X, and you can see it is a little bit dark off to the sides. But when you look at it from outside, I don't think anyone's going to notice, so it wouldn't stop me from using this combination. But if you're going to use a 5-foot dome, I would recommend getting the Aputure domes because they're deeper, and this compensates for the tightness of the COB. Now, in my opinion, it's not lighting up the front of the dome quite as good as the 1200D did, but I think it's so minimal no one's ever going to notice. So where this could possibly be a negative is if you're lighting up a large space. If you're used to the flood you get with the 1200B, you might be a bit surprised that you don't have it with the 1200X. So it makes sense that the 1200X is so much brighter because it's got a more concentrated beam. Now the same thing applies to the reflectors. People have just been comparing the wide reflector on one light to the wide reflector on the other light. The Aputure wide reflector is 45 degrees and the Evoke wide reflector is 60 degrees. With the medium reflectors, the Aputure is 30 degrees and the Nanlux is 45 degrees. And with the narrow reflectors, the Aputure is 15 degrees and the Nanlux is 26 degrees. So my results are going to be very different to a lot of other results that are out there because I'm comparing the reflectors by beam angle and not by their names. With no modifiers attached, the 1200X is 54% brighter than the Evoke 1200B, and it is also brighter than the Aputure 1200D. With reflectors with matching 45-degree beam angles, the Aputure 1200X is dramatically brighter than the Aputure 1200D, but the Evoke 1200B is 7% brighter than the Aputure 1200X. The Evoke 1200B with its 26-degree reflector is 39% brighter than the 1200X with its 30-degree reflector. Now let's have a look at maximum spot. The Aputure 1200X has a 15-degree spot reflector, whereas the maximum spot reflector on the Evoke was the previous 26-degree reflector. So if you're just looking at maximum brightness regardless of beam angle, the Aputure is definitely the winner here, being 50% brighter. Now it's time to have a look at how much it costs and what you get for your money. So the reflector kit, which has the 30-degree reflector and the 15-degree reflector, is sold separately. So let's go over the US dollar prices first. The light kit sells for about $3,000 and you're looking at about $210 for the reflector kit, and in Australian dollars, $4,750 for the light and $335 for the reflector kit. That really is crazy value for money. Let's take a look at what's in the light kit first. Now, everything is packed on top of everything else inside this kit when you first get it. So I think the first thing people are going to do is try to figure out how to pack everything more efficiently, including the reflectors. All right, let's start pulling things out. You get your power cable, which has a Nutrix connector. This is 6 meters long and it's made from rubber. It's not made from PVC. You get a head lead, which is 7.5 meters long. You can't link multiple head leads together. You get a bag that has the contents diagram so you can find where everything is. You get some stickers and the warranty card. You get the lightning clamp. Next thing I'll pull out is the controller and power supply. Let's take a closer look at this. On the top, you've got your carry handle and the output for the light. On the side, you've got your other inputs and outputs. On the top row, you've got your DMX in and your DMX out. Now you can set the DMX out to terminate. And you've also got a USB port for your firmware updates. On the next row down, you've got 2 local area network connections and your Nutrix power input. On the back panel, you have the receiver for the clamp mount. On the opposite side of the control box to the cable inputs, you've got another option for your stand mount. And the cooling fan is located on the bottom, which helps isolate any fan noise. Next thing I'll pull out is the head. Let's take a closer look at this. The stirrup has a single disc locking brake system with a ratchet handle. On both sides of the lights, you've got a thread for mounting options. On the bottom of the light, you've got feet, which all have threads for mounting options as well. And you've got 3 cooling fans. Now, in terms of the cooling fans, they're not the quietest ones I've come across on a 1200. That honor belongs to the Aputure 1200D. But these are definitely quieter than any other cooling fans that I've come across on a 1200 watt light. In terms of how well they work, I've operated this light for hours on end, pointing straight up, level, and pointing straight down. And at no point did it begin to overheat. Now let's have a look at the reflector kit. And all of the reflectors are made from metal. And they're double skinned, so if you dent the outside, it won't dent the inside. Now they come with a load of molded padding. So you've got this one piece that you can put inside the bigger reflector. You've got this other piece that will connect to the next reflector and fit perfectly inside the other reflector so they don't scratch each other when they're being transported. And you've got this other piece that goes inside the smaller reflector so that the 45-degree reflector that's supplied with the light can fit inside that. All right, let's do a quick run through of the system, and we'll start off with the CCT mode because that is most likely where you're going to be. In the top row, you've got all of the menu settings that are applicable to this mode. So you can see what you've got it set to. You've got your 3 parameters of adjustment. You've got your intensity, you've got your CCT, and you've got your green and magenta correction. Your CCT range is 2500 Kelvin up to 10,000 Kelvin. Now, because we've got the one control knob, you can't quick select things, so you have to scroll to every single adjustment that you want to make. And the light is dimmable in 0.1% increments manually. To quickly go to your other light modes, you can press the light mode button. You've got a choice of CCT, XY, effects, and your personalized Sidus effects. We've already had a look at CCT, so let's look at XY. So XY does give you some limited color function. Now bear in mind, this is not a full color gamut light, and the emitters were selected based on how accurately they could produce white light, not colored light. So this mode is a little bit weird, which is why I think Aputure don't make a big point that this light can do color. However, this mode would absolutely hero if you're trying to match to a color that is weirdly off-white. Let's go back to our light mode and have a look at the effects menu. To start your effects, press the button. The fire effect is pretty cool because you've got that lower CCT range. To go back in your menu, press the back button. And as you can see here, we've got the regular special effects. And it's an icon-driven menu, which is really simple to operate. Let's quickly have a look at presets. This is where you can save and recall up to 10 settings. Now let's take a look in the menu system. And the one thing I really like about the menu system is the first thing that pops up is a submenu. So you can quickly find what it is you're looking for. Most of the time, I'm just going to the control settings. So let's take a look at what's in there. You can change your DMX settings. You can adjust your CRMX settings. You've got your Sidus Bluetooth settings, your Ethernet settings, and then you're back to your DMX settings. To go back to the submenu, press the back button. Now let's take a look at the system settings. You've got product info. This tells you your firmware version, your serial number, hardware version, but if you scroll further down the menu, you can see your operating status. You can do things here like check the temperature. Back in the system menu, you've also got your firmware update, so you can do it with a USB stick instead of using the phone app. You can do a factory reset. You can select your dimmer curves, of which you have a choice of 4. You can select your output. You've got a choice of maximum output or constant output, and you can select your white light standard. You've got a choice of CIE Daylight, which is what most cameras run to, and you've got a choice of black body, which is what a lot of manufacturers set their lights to. That's what I call the Planckian curve. The next thing in the menu is lead follow, and then you've got your high speed shooting mode. If you select high speed, you'll be completely flicker free, but you can't dim below 40%. Next thing in the menu is your fan speed selection. You can select smart, high, medium, silent, and DMX controlled. Now, just a note with DMX control, it doesn't line up to the manual modes. So with medium, for example, over DMX, the brightness drops, but it doesn't drop if you're operating it manually. Next thing in the menu is your studio mode. If you've got this selected, the light will automatically turn on when power is sent to it. You can also adjust your screensaver times. And if you feel like a challenge, you can also use the light in a different language. Let's take a look at how the light performs with no modifier attached. Now I do these tests at a distance of 2 meters away from the wall. That way you can see the light stand and myself to get some perspective. As you can see, this definitely has a tighter beam angle than most COB lights. But it does have a nice distribution of light across the beam, regardless of the CCT that you dial in, and it has a nice gentle drop off on the edges, which could actually be creatively useful. At a distance of 3 meters, the shadows are a bit soft on the edges, but still very good. Now let's have a look at how this performs at a distance of 5.5 meters through a window. And you get nice crisp shadows, regardless of the CCT that you dial in. Now, if you're lighting up a large area at night, you can definitely see that this doesn't have the spread of other COB lights. Now let's take a look at the light with the supplied 45-degree wide reflector. And I'm starting the test at a distance of 2 meters. Now it looks to me not to be the most even reflector that I've come across. This seems to be regardless of the CCT that you dial in. Now I don't think this is a fault in the reflector, I just don't think it's optimized for this sort of distance. So I've moved back now to 3 meters, and as per my suspicion, it has definitely helped out the reflector. It now has a more even beam, with a cleaner, more useful drop-off on the edge. And the results are the same regardless of the CCT that you dial in. Now I'm going to take some measurements to check the evenness of the beam. The first reading will be from what I think is the centre of the beam, then from what I'd consider by eye to be the edge of the beam before we get the drop-off, and the last reading I will take from what looks to my eye to be just outside the beam and in the drop-off area. And we have double shadowing, which is typical of a faceted reflector. Now let's take a look at this through a window at a distance of 5.5 meters. And I have to admit, I was actually surprised at the quality of the shadows. And if you're lighting up a large area with this, it does a pretty good job. Now let's take a look at the optional 30-degree medium reflector. Now there are two noticeable circles of light here. You've got your 30-degree beam angle, and you've got your drop off towards the edges. The results are the same regardless of the CCT that you dial in. Now I'm going to take a few readings to check the distribution. The first reading is from what I consider to be the centre of the beam. The next reading is what by eye looks to be the edge of the 30-degree beam. And the last reading is in the drop-off area. And these are the shadow qualities. Now let's have a look at how this performs through a window at a distance of 5.5 meters. And we are definitely sacrificing some shadow quality for output now. But it still looks better than what you could get out of, say, an M18. And this is how it performs if you're lighting up a large space outdoors. Now let's take a look at the optional 15-degree narrow reflector. And once again, there are two distinct beams in play here, the 15-degree beam and the outer drop-off area. The results are the same regardless of the CCT that you dial in. Now I'm going to take a few readings here from the center of the beam out, because by eye it doesn't look very even at all. And at a distance of 3 meters, shadows from a spot reflector are always going to be a bit funky. Now let's take a look at how this performs through a window at a distance of 5.5 meters. We've definitely gained a lot of output, but it really has come at the sacrifice of our shadow qualities. And if you're using this to light a large area outside, it's hard to distinguish between this and the medium reflector, except that this reflector has a gigantic hotspot in the center. Okay, let's start off the DMX testing. The 1200X is receiving its commands via its internal CRMX receiver. It is running off an 8-bit CCT profile, its dimmer is set to linear, and for the start of the tests, the smoothing is turned on. To give you something to compare it to, I have an Evoke 1200B. The Evoke is also receiving its commands via its internal CRMX receiver. It also has its dimmer set to linear. It is also running an 8-bit profile, and for the start of the tests, it also has its smoothing turned on. Both lights are receiving their commands at the same time. Let's start off the tests with instant on-off cues. Let's do that test again, but this time both lights have their smoothing turned off. Now I'm going to leave the smoothing turned off and do some 1-second cues. And as you can see, the lights are both useless. Now both lights have their smoothing turned back on. Let's do some 1/2-second cues. And just to note, the aperture is set to its minimum smoothing. Now for some 1-second cues. Now for some 2.5-second cues. And now for some 5-second cues. Now let's have a look at some CCT changeovers between 5600 Kelvin and 3200 Kelvin, starting with instant changeovers. And just a reminder, the smoothing is still turned on. Now we're going to do that test again, but this time with the smoothing turned off. Now let's have a look at some half-second cues with the smoothing turned on. Now for some 1-second cues. Now for some 2.5-second cues. Now let's take a look at some 5-second cues. Now let's take a look at some 2.5-second cues, but this time with the lights running at a maximum 10% brightness. Now the same test again with 5-second cues. Again, the maximum brightness is only 10%. Now let's do some 2.5-second cues, again from 10% brightness to 0% brightness, but this time with the 1200X set to its feather or medium smoothing mode. Now let's have a look at 5-second cues with the same settings. Now let's do some 2.5-second cues from 10% brightness to 0% brightness with the 1200X set to its maximum smoothing. And now for some 5-second cues with the same settings. Now let's go through all of the data I've collected, starting off with the AC power draw. The maximum power draw recorded over a week of testing was 1425 watt. At 3200 Kelvin, it's pulling 1416 watt, and at 5600 Kelvin, it's pulling 1389 watt. And the light has really good power factor unity scores. Now the light has two dimming systems, a completely flicker-free system for high-speed shooting that won't dim below 40%, but these results are for their pulse width modulation dimming system, which is running at 20 kHz. And this definitely isn't high-speed flicker-free. These are the dimming results for 3200 Kelvin. I've taken readings at 100%, 75%, 50%, 25%, 10%, 5%, 1%, and 0.1%. The CCT remains incredibly accurate. The color render score does drop once you get below 10%, and the delta UV or white point accuracy stays extremely consistent. These are the results for 5600 Kelvin, and the CCT stays extremely consistent all the way down to 1%. The TM30 color render score remains a consistent 97, all the way down to 5%, and even below that it's still good. And all the way down to 1%, the delta UV or white point placement is extremely consistent. Let's take a look at the average CCT accuracy, and this is taken without any modifiers. I took readings at every Kelvin between 2500 to 7000 Kelvin. And once again, these are incredibly accurate. When we take a look at some of the higher CCTs though, the accuracy definitely isn't as good. These are the TM30 color render results, and this is taken without any modifiers. The lowest score is a 92, and that's all the way down at the very bottom Kelvins. But over the bulk of the CCT range, the light is scoring 95 plus. Even all the way up at 10,000 Kelvin, it's still scoring a 96. This is the delta UV or white point placement when the light is set to CIE Daylight with no modifier. From 2500 Kelvin to 4000 Kelvin, it does have a very slight, imperceivable magenta hue. Between 4050 Kelvin to 5000 Kelvin, the light breaks away from the Planckian curve and heads towards the daylight curve, which is why it doesn't have an average. And from 5500 Kelvin upwards, it is tracking slightly below the daylight curve. Now the readings with the reflector on are way more accurate than this, but I don't have the time to do a complete set of readings twice for this light. Okay, now let's take a closer look at some of our more commonly used CCTs. And we're going to start off without the reflector on. Now without the reflector on, this light has some of the best CCT accuracies I've ever come across. Now these results are taken with the light set to CIE Daylight. When I dialed in 2500 Kelvin, I got 2499. The TM30 color testing scores were 92% average color accuracy with an average 97% color saturation. With the CRI scores, R6, R7, R8, R9 and R12 were below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point was very accurate with a delta UV of minus 0.0006. So this means that the light has no noticeable green or magenta color hue. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin, I got 3200 Kelvin with an SSI score of 88. The TM30 color render scores were 94% average color accuracy with an average 99% color saturation. With the CRI scores, R9 and R12 were below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of minus 0.0009. That means it's got no perceivable color hue or green magenta shift, but it does have an ever so imperceivable amount of shift towards magenta. When I dialed in 4400 Kelvin, I got 4401. The TM30 color testing results were 97% average color accuracy with an average 100% color saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 is below 90 and only just. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point is almost perfectly on the Planckian curve with a delta UV of 0.0001. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got 5605. The SSI score was 88. The TM30 color testing results came in with 97% average color accuracy and an average 100% color saturation. With the CRI scores, only R9 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point without the modifier is not quite on the daylight curve. It's a little bit under with a delta UV of plus 0.0018. When I dialed in the top Kelvin of 10,000, I got 10,353. The TN30 colour testing results were 96% average colour accuracy with an average 100% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point is still tracking to the daylight curve with a delta UV of plus 0.0020. Now we'll take a closer look at those kelvins again, but this time with the reflector on. So just a reminder that with the reflector on, we don't get the super accurate CCTs, but we get super accurate white point or delta UV instead. When I dialed in 2500 Kelvin, I got 2525. The TM30 colour testing results were 92% average colour accuracy with an average 96% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, R7, R8, R9 and R12 are all below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point is almost perfect with a delta UV of minus 0.0001. which is slightly more accurate than it was with the reflector attached. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin, I got 3247. With the reflector attached, it was smack on at 3200. The SSI score came in at 88. The TM30 colour testing results were 94% average colour accuracy with an average 98% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, R9 and R12 are below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a perfect delta UV of 0, which is more accurate than it was without the reflector attached. When I dialed in 4400 Kelvin with the reflector attached, I got 4439, which is not bad, but not quite as accurate as it was without the reflector. The TM30 colour testing results were 97% average colour accuracy with an average 100% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, R9 is below 90 and R12 is only just below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point comes in with a delta UV of plus 0.0005, which means it has no perceivable green or magenta shift. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got 5705, which is 100 Kelvin less accurate than it was without the reflector. The SSI score came in at 88. The TM30 colour testing results were 97% average colour accuracy with an average 100% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, R9 is below 90 and R12 is only just below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And with the reflector on, the white point is almost smack on the daylight curve with a delta UV of plus 0.0028. When I dialed in the top Kelvin of 10,000, I got 10,684, which is a little bit more than 300 Kelvin less accurate than it was with the reflector attached. The TM30 colour testing results were 96% average colour accuracy with an average 100% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the light is still tracking to the daylight curve with a delta UV of plus 0.0028. Now let's take a look at the spectrometer readings with the light set to 5600 Kelvin, with and without the supplied reflector, with it set to track to the black body curve. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin set to the black body curve, I got 5648 with an SSI score of 87. The TN30 colour render results were 97% average colour accuracy with an average 102% colour saturation. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point isn't exactly perfect, but it has no perceivable green or magenta shift with a delta UV of minus 0.0009. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin with a supplied reflector and set to the black body curve, I got 5729 with an SSI score of 88. The TM30 colour testing results were 97% average colour accuracy with an average 101% colour saturation. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point is almost perfect to the Planckian curve with a delta UV of minus 0.0001. Alright, so what do I think about the product? Well, do I like it? Am I going to keep it? Well, yes. And I've also bought another two with my own money. So I think this is a fantastic product. Is it going to replace my Evoke 1200Bs? Well, not yet. Here's a couple of things you need to do, Aputure, if you want me to sell these and replace them with these. Number one, you need to get rid of that 1 second delay that's on your smoothing. All right, so I'm keeping these for when I need to do DMX queuing. All right, this is, sorry, but your DMX is not the best. And the other thing you need to do for me to ditch these and to buy these is dramatically improve your repair time, okay? Now, I know you've made huge improvements. It took you 3 weeks to do the last repair that you did for me, which was a huge improvement over the 5 weeks it took for the previous repair. Prior to that, I had a 1200D go down. That took you guys 5 months to fix, and it took you guys 8 months to fix one of my Nova 600s. So you're clearly heading in the right direction, but to be completely honest with you, you're still taking twice as long as the other brands that I keep in my truck. Now, sometimes I make decisions on product based on what I can get repaired in a hurry. I've got a lot of lights sitting in my vehicles that I think are the second best lights, but I know that I can get them fixed in 7 to 10 days. So fix those two things for us. Fix your repair time, fix the DMX smoothing, and I will 100% replace all of these with all of these. It'll be a no-brainer.